Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please hit that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate a small amount given in the link in the description box. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin is a West Asia analyst specializing in the Arab-Israel conflict and Palestine affairs. Mouin, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you again.
I wanted to focus on the war. Maybe if we could start by asking you, how would you describe the war in the last 1 month?
Well, that's a very broad question. My impression is that the United States and Israel launched this war in the expectation that it would be very quickly and very decisively resolved. Although there is a question mark there, it's quite clear that the decision maker, in this case, the US President Donald Trump, who's known to be a vacuous, thoroughly ignorant individual, and who is also known to have an aversion to long and costly military entanglements, that he was presented a picture that if he endorsed the war plan that was put in front of him, it would be only a few days before a decisive outcome would be achieved. And the question becomes whether those who presented him with this assessment genuinely believed it, or did they believe that it was necessary to present a scenario to Trump that they knew to be false, but would nevertheless meet their objective, which is getting the United States into this war, because once it stepped in, it would be impossible for it to simply reverse course and bring it to an end. So my suspicion is that there was a bit of this and a bit of that. So we have seen, for example, stories that the leader of the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Agency, Mossad, genuinely believed that if you could just kill a few of the most senior Iranian leaders, that there would be a popular uprising, and it would be the end of the whole story. He's clearly been reading too many thrillers. Others, I think, particularly those in Washington, understood that this was not going to be one, two, three, and over, but that it was necessary to present this picture of easy and quick victory to Trump, who, again, I think needs to be emphasized, makes Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush look like a genius, in order to get him to sign off on this. So what happened is that there was a belief, I think also a poor assessment of not only Iranian capabilities, but more importantly, of Iran's willingness to match Israel and American aggression, step by step. So it was believed, I think, that Iran would be very hesitant to launch any missiles against the territories of Arab states on the Persian Gulf because there have been significantly improved relations with them. Well, it absolutely didn't hesitate to do so. It has even been launching missiles against American facilities as far afield as Jordan. Secondly, it was believed that Iran would either hesitate or prove incapable of taking control of the Straits of Hormuz, the key bottleneck through which so much energy and other essential products flows, and it had absolutely no compunction about doing that, and has managed to do so successfully. And a third miscalculation was that Iran was the last man standing in the coalition that calls itself the Axis of Resistance. And I think from the Israeli perspective, they would administer a fatal blow to Iran, and then they would barge into Lebanon and clean up what was left of Hezbollah. Well, that hasn't worked according to plan either. So, to get back to your question, um, You asked, what is my assessment of the war 1 month after it started? I think the most important part of my response needs to be this war wasn't supposed to last 1 month. It was supposed to be over within at most a week. And the very fact that this war is still going on after more than a month shows that Iran's strategy of transforming a intensive armed conflict into a prolonged war of attrition, the purpose of which is to transform it not only into a direct confrontation between the US and Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other, but rather into a regional crisis, and even more so now into a global energy and economic crisis, appears to be working. At the same time, Iran has borne an enormous cost, and that cost is going to continue increasing. And the cost to many other states in the region is getting increasingly high as well. That can have very significant long term consequences for them, for their security, for their economic model, and so on.
What do you make of a Washington Post report about several U.S. intelligence agencies saying that the objective of an uprising caused by or triggered by decapitation of leaders is very, very unlikely? In other words, if Mossad was so disillusioned or if it was so wrong, how do you explain this massive divergence between the intelligence agency in the United States and in Israel?
Well, I don't think you need to be an intelligence professional to understand that where you're dealing with a disorganized and essentially leaderless opposition, much of which is based in exile, and which was very severely battered by the very large scale and brutal repression against the demonstrations in Iran in January of this year. That if you simply remove a few leadership figures while the country is being intensively bombed, that this isn't going to produce a popular uprising. One can think of circumstances in which it might have resulted, for example, in a coup or something like that. But the idea that you're going to get a popular uprising under conditions of foreign aggression, I'm not really sure, what novels the people who put forward this scenario have been reading. And again, I think one of the unanswered questions is the extent to which the people promoting this scenario were genuinely delusional versus the extent to which they concocted the scenario that they knew to be false, but which they felt was necessary to persuade the utterly vacuous and thoroughly ignorant chief decision maker in the White House to sign off on this war, in the knowledge that once it started, then they could continue pushing a scenario for deeper involvement and further escalation, which is exactly what's happened. Now we're talking about the potential for ground troops, for example.
You mentioned about the war supposedly to be lasting for weeks, and now we are already on the second month. U.S. Secretary of War Marco Rubio just gave an interview to
Secretary of State. Yeah.
Secretary of State, excuse me. Um, Pete Hegseth is the Secretary of War. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I think the Iranians are very happy about that.
yes, of course. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, just gave an interview to Al Jazeera, and he said that we are again weeks away from concluding this war. He didn't use the word concluding, but he said the U.S. objectives of destroying Iran's industrial capacity to produce weapons and degrading of missiles would be achieved in weeks. I wonder what's your reading of that statement. Is it a cry for an off ramp of the war, or is it just a bluff uh, that is going underneath a massive preparation to continue this war for too long?
The problem with your question is that with this administration particularly, um, it's impossible to understand these statements rationally and to provide a rational response on that basis because Rubio has just made the statement you asked me about. In a few hours, Hegseth will say something that is totally at variance with it. And then Donald Trump will say three or four things before midnight that thoroughly contradict themselves. And on that basis, it's really impossible to give a precise response to your question. I mean, if you know, under normal circumstances where you were dealing with sane politicians, people who are at some level connected to reality, then I would say that perhaps sounds like a wish for an off ramp, and it sounds like the U.S. is beginning to define clear objectives for its war against Iran. But that's not the case because we've heard so many different objectives, from regime change to Trump saying regime change has already been achieved, to reopening the Straits of Hormuz, which of course were open before this war was launched, to not only ending Iran's nuclear program, but removing all the enriched uranium from its territory. These people are all over the place, and it's therefore impossible to respond to make a assessment of U.S. policy on the basis of what one official happened to say in one interview. Because if there's one thing that you can be absolutely sure of, it's that it's going to be contradicted at least half a dozen times before midnight. So, what I would say is that the U.S. objective, as I understand it at this point, is to increase the military pressure on Iran so that it either capitulates or collapses. And separately, we have the Israeli war objectives, which go well beyond regime change and which are focused very much on state collapse and ensuring that Iran no longer has the capacity to defend itself against further Israeli aggression. And of course, caught between these are the Arab states. This war was launched without consulting them, and they are the ones most directly in the line of fire and paying the highest price. And then you have a whole separate set of considerations which are of more concern to the US as a global power than to Israel as a regional proxy. And these have to do with global energy markets, the global economy, and so on. And the question now becomes is how long can Iran endure and prolong this war of attrition in a way that leads the U.S. To conclude that it can no longer afford to continue with this, as opposed to Trump now being sold, another silver bullet. Well, if you just seize this island or that navy base on the Iranian coast, then the Iranians will collapse or capitulate or whatever. So, I'm sorry I'm not being precise, but we're dealing with a fundamentally irrational, self contradictory leadership that doesn't itself know what it is doing and what it wants to achieve. There's the stories Americans love to tell about themselves, about the Congress being the greatest deliberative body on earth, I think is what they call it. It's not even discussing this thing, let alone playing a role. Checks and balances and all the rest of that nonsense. But we're really dealing here with a mad king, a mad emperor, surrounded by yes men, who's very easily manipulated. And so what happens tomorrow or even this evening is entirely up in the air.
There is this old debate or discussion about who is in the driver's seat between the US and Israel. In
Mhm.
other words, who calls the shot? And I wanted to reignite that question given if we are thinking about the short term future of the war, it is not inconceivable to think that the US might want an off ramp sooner, given the domestic political situation, given the economic conditions,
It's
etc.,
an election
etc.
year.
Absolutely. And one can also argue that Netanyahu and his gangsters would fight until the last Israelis, or however one can define it.
Fight
Uh,
until the last American, as I think better put.
Absolutely, yeah. Um, then the question becomes who is in the driver's seat if we are thinking about whether there will be a near term end to the war. So, what is your sense of who is calling the shot?
Well, if you look at a dog, you'll see that the dog wags its tail. It's not the tail that wags the dog. And in this case, the dog is very clearly the United States, and the tail is its proxy in the Middle East, Israel. Having said that, it's also known that Israel has been agitating for a U.S. war against Iran for decades. It has been doing everything possible to persuade every previous U.S. administration, including the first Trump administration, to do exactly what the U.S. is doing now and has failed. And so we need to ask ourselves, well, why has it now succeeded? Did anything change in the Middle East? Did anything change in Washington? Did anything change in Israel? And what I think has happened is that you have a coalition of Israel and its advocates and its apologists working in close consultation with powerful factions within the Trump administration. You know, the Iran war hawks, the neocons, the Israel firsters, and so on. And they collectively managed to persuade this leader who is very obviously in cognitive decline, who has been getting huge sums of money and support from pro-Israel billionaires and so on, that you can do this, you can do it on the cheap, and you can get out quickly by and pose as the conquering hero. So it's quite clear that Israel had every interest and did everything it possibly could to ensure that this war was launched. But I also think that the efforts of Israel and its advocates were insufficient. In order to succeed, ultimately, they also needed the close collaboration of powerful forces within the Trump administration, you know, some of whom are, of course, organically tied to Israel, but others of whom pressed for this for what they believe to be primarily American rather than Israeli reasons. And I'll make a last comment. I think the real danger in this situation is not that you have people who are knowingly putting the interests of a foreign state ahead of the national security interests of their own state. That would be bad enough. I think we're dealing with something much more dangerous, which is that you have a political class in the United States, which has largely been indoctrinated to an extent that it can no longer distinguish between US and Israeli interests. They see them as one and the same. They are convinced that what is bad for Israel will have a negative impact on the United States, and that what is good for Israel is good for the United States. So the real danger is that they no longer are able to make a distinction between the national security interests of their own country and that of a foreign proxy.
I wonder why you say no longer. Is it a new development?
Well, I mean, we've had it, it's been developing for decades, clearly. But I would argue that in last 10, 20 years, it has become dominant. And it's not, it's not something that's unique to either Republicans or the Trump administration. I mean, if you look at the Biden administration, you have people like Brett McGurk, Antony Blinken, I would argue Biden himself, who largely, for the most part, seem incapable of distinguishing between American and Israeli interests. They see them as organically related as in many respects as one and the same. Uh, Having said that, of course, Biden did not sign off on this war against Iran. It's a question whether he would have, had he remained in office. But my broader point is, no, I don't think this is something that's unique to the Trump administration.
Uh, what seems to me is relatively clear is about this whole talk about ground invasion. I mean, there are experts who say that, analysts rather, who say that there are speculations about or preparations about a special operation in the Karg Island through which one.
Special military operation.
Yes, I get the reference. Yeah, to come back to the point uh, in the Karg Island, but if you look at the numbers of mobilizations, about 50,000 troops, it doesn't look like a full-blown invasion, because if we think about the 2003 Iraq occupation, that was about 150,000 or 140,000 American soldiers, along with other NATO forces, 30,000 or more. And there was about 50,000 soldiers even in 2011 when US retreated. Is it fair to say that the question about ground invasion is out of even Trump's mind, and all these talks are just ways of blackmailing or for propaganda purposes?
No, I don't think it's propaganda. I think a um, effort to seize Iranian territory is all but certain. But to go even beyond what you said, these 50,000 U.S. Military personnel that are being prepared for this, they're not all combat soldiers. I believe less than half of them are actual combat forces. The rest are administrative staff, logistics, and so on, who would not be directly involved. And this gets back to an earlier part of our discussion, which is, what is a purpose? Um, there seems to be, among some, there seems to be a belief that if the United States can successfully seize Iranian territory, whether it's Hug Island or islands further south, the sovereignty over which is contested between Iran and the United Arab Emirates, or perhaps some territory on the Iranian coast, or some combination of the above, that the purpose here is, not to launch a massive invasion and march on Tehran or whatever, but that the symbolism of Iran losing military control of territory will have such a profound impact on morale and politics and whatever, that the Iranian leadership will feel compelled to either capitulate to whatever US demands are made of it, and if it refuses to do so, it will collapse. Um, my view is that those who are pushing for what you correctly identify would be a limited military operation are doing so in the knowledge that this will lead to mission creep. In other words, you seize an island or a beachhead in on the Iranian coast, that results in U.S. casualties. Then Trump will authorize the deployment of further troops. They will try to seize additional territory, and before you know it, you have what amounts to a full-scale invasion of Iran. Now, whether that can succeed or not is, of course, a very different question. But I do believe there are powerful forces pushing for the deployment of ground troops in the full knowledge that this would only be the beginning, but that presenting it as a small scale symbolic initiative that would somehow have enormous benefits is viewed as the best way to persuade the leader in the White House to agree to this.
Quite apart from the military capability, the financial implication would be enormous.
For the United States?
Of course. And
Yeah.
Trump is already talking about 1.5 trillion US dollar as defense budget for the next year. That would shoot up the fiscal deficit to an extent where bond prices, bond yields would rise so much that interest rates would go up, and it will effectively create a stagnant economy. And the only thing, or perhaps the main driver of the economy, the stock market, is also at its one of its worst. And we have to understand that it is reeling from the tariff wars already. So, given all that circumstance, it would be nearly impossible to do that for a very long time. Um, I wanted to discuss a little bit about Israel itself, because there is a lot of censorship and it's hard to understand what's going on there. We are, of course, reading news about oil refineries in Haifa being attacked by missiles, whether Iranian or Lebanese, we don't know. There is also the IDF chief saying that Israel might collapse on itself because of
The military. Mm,
because of shortage of military.
mm.
What do you make of all this? And if you could tell us a little bit about the impact of the war on Israel.
Well, as you mentioned, there's very heavy censorship about the impacts of these various missile strikes on Israeli territory. I will say that by all indications, and according to analysts who know and understand Iran much better than I do, the war that Iran has prepared for and that it has prepared for decades was a US attack more than an Israeli attack. And it therefore appears that Iran thus far is focused much more on weakening the US than the Israeli position, which is also logical when you think about it, that, that once you have the ear of the Americans, the Israeli proxy will follow. I mean, it's quite telling, I think, that if you look at all the diplomatic activity that's taking place now. They had the recent meeting between, I think, the Egyptians, the Turks, the Pakistanis, and one other country, I can't remember which, and these other initiatives. No one is bothering to talk to the Israelis because they understand you don't need to talk to the Israelis because
I think it
once
was Egypt.
Egypt, sorry, yes, of course. Um, uh, Once you have the Americans, you have the Israelis. So there's no need to separately engage with the Israelis. But getting back to your question, so although it's true that the Iranians have been focusing much more on US assets and on the Persian Gulf region than on Israel, when you look at what we do know about Iranian strikes outside Israel, I find it a little bit rich that Iran has been able to conduct very successful, very precise strikes throughout the Persian Gulf, but somehow in Israel, it's only managing to occasionally inflict limited damage from shrapnel from an interceptor missile. I mean, it seems to me it's quite clearly propaganda, and I'm sure that the damage to Israel has been significantly larger than what has been revealed so far. How much larger? To what extent is its military infrastructure, its military industrial base being affected? Those are open questions that I don't think anyone can answer until more information becomes available. But there was another part of your question that I think I neglected.
Yeah, I think my primary question was about the impact of the war on Israel.
Yeah, so there's that. I mean, the physical impact, if you will, and then there is the economic and moral impact. And I think the Israeli economy has thus far been quite fortunate that although it has, it's had its credit rating downgraded, economists have noted that the long-term impact of the past 2 years post October 2023 is ultimately going to be significant. But the Israeli economy um, has withstood the past 2 years reasonably well. I mean, if you look at its current situation, but given the stress that it was already under, and given the impact now of all the lost work days and now damage to actual crucial infrastructure and so on, I think this could well be the war launched by Israel that pushed it over the edge economically. And then there's the third aspect, which concerns public morale in Israel. And here I think there is also the impact of the Israeli public, which on the whole I think remains overwhelmingly supportive of their country's latest war of aggression. Nevertheless, having once again been promised a quick and decisive victory, and now finding out that Iran's missile stocks, which they were repeatedly told are, 70%, 90%, 200% destroyed, are nowhere near that, and that Iran remains capable of firing missiles virtually at will against the length and breadth of Israel.
Uh, and what is the impact of all this, particularly Israel having to fight a three-front external wars with Yemen, South Lebanon, and Iran? What is the impact of that external front on the occupation itself, or in other words, what's the impact of all this on the Palestinian struggle for freedom?
Well, I think the immediate impact on the Palestinians is that, I mean, how long have we been talking now? For more than half an hour. And this is the first time you've asked me about the Palestinians. And I think in any other interview, it would be similar, or perhaps it wouldn't be raised at all. And so this war has successfully pushed Palestine off the headlines and given Israel much greater freedom of action within both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I mean, people are probably not aware that today, Monday, the Israeli parliament adopted this death penalty bill, that allows for the execution of Palestinians. I mean, it's another apartheid law, but most likely very few people would hear about it. The question becomes that Israel launched this war for two purposes. The first is to eliminate Iran as an actual or potential regional adversary. And the second is to consolidate a position of regional hegemony for the foreseeable future. Israel managed to significantly weaken Hezbollah. Of course, you've had the Gaza genocide. It's now launching daily widespread attacks throughout the West Bank. The Assad regime was ousted in Syria, and Israel has managed to demolish that country's military arsenal. And from Israel's perspective, Iran was what it calls the head of the octopus, the last remaining obstacle, and that once you get rid of Iran or the Iranian leadership and it's of the Islamic Republic, then Israel can consolidate hegemony over the entire Middle East for a generation. And leaders have already been talking about taking on Turkey next. I mean, Turkey, which is a NATO member, which has not been under sanctions since the 1970s, as has Iran, and so on. The problem becomes Israel is a small state. It is geographically vulnerable. It has a limited resource base. It has a limited demographic base. I mean, we were just talking about warnings given by its chief of staff that its military can no longer maintain the pace of mobilization of the past 2 years, and that if it does so, it risks collapse. And as a ethno-nationalist apartheid state, it can't just bring in volunteers or mercenaries from around the world. So, and as important as any of this, unlike South Africa, Israel is also entirely dependent on foreign support, military, political, diplomatic, and so on. And so, what I think we're seeing in Iran is that Israel has bitten off more than the United States can chew on its behalf, and that a war which is intended to consolidate Israeli regional hegemony, it may well turn out to be the war that demonstrates the limits of Israel's regional power.
I had a couple more questions, so feel free to be brief in the interest of your time. I have time, but one on the Gulf Arab states, which we had discussed in the context of the genocide earlier in the interviews I did with you, and one on Europe. So maybe very briefly on the Gulf Arab states. Um, you mentioned about this war being launched without their consent. Um, will this war make them rethink about the pact they made with the United States, basically buying security by becoming a vassalate state, uh, creating an economy, the petrodollar system, the investments in American assets, etc., etc. Um, will all of this now be rethought because now that they've realized that hosting the Americans is now making them susceptible to attacks that the Americans are unable to defend them?
Excuse me. Well, I think it's already causing a rethink. Um, but the question is whether they will be able to do anything about it. Um, just to be clear, as you mentioned, uh, these states have a close alignment with the United States for a variety of reasons. But from their perspective, one of, if not the key reason, is that they view Washington as the ultimate guarantor of their national security against any foreign or perhaps even domestic threat. Now let's look at what's happened in this war. Despite articles in the Western press that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and others were secretly urging Washington to launch this war and stay the course and so on, I don't really buy any of that. Um, uh, I won't get into the reasons now. I think we may have discussed these before. But these states perfectly understood that in the event of a war, they would be directly in the line of fire, and the United States and Israel would be either incapable or unwilling to defend them. And that's exactly what's happened. They were, if anything, urging the United States not to launch this war and to rein in its favorite pyromaniac and regional arsonist, Israel. They failed to do that. And once the war became inevitable, of course, they felt they had no choice but to allow the United States to use the military bases that it had established on their territory since the Kuwait crisis of the early 1990s. And as a result, I'm not going to repeat what you said. The United States, which was meant to be the ultimate guarantor of their national security, its mere presence now is, for many of them, the greatest threat to their national security since they were established as modern states. Um, Secondly, I think they were already involved in a process of strategic diversification for some years, and in many respects, for reasons that are unrelated to the issues we're discussing today. But the question becomes, moving forward, are they still going to tolerate having these U.S. bases on their territory when, first of all, those bases are used to launch wars that they don't consider their war, that were launched without consulting them, that were launched without their approval, that were launched from their perspective on behalf of Israel, that created this enormous national security crisis for them. And then they also see that the US is stopping at nothing to protect Israel from Iranian attacks, but has basically abandoned them. So, are they going to continue with this? Will they still be prepared to invest tens of billions of dollars into weaponry, and anti-missile defenses and so on, which have largely proven useless? Well, you would think that the answer to each of these questions would be a clear yes. But it's not that simple because these are small and vulnerable states. For them, essentially, there are only two good outcomes. The first would have been that this war would have never started, so that's no longer on the agenda. And the second, that it would result in a stable and orderly transition to a new regime in Iran that with whom they feel they can have greater mutual confidence. And I think the chances of that happening are virtually zero as well. So they feel very much left in the lurch by the Americans, and they feel left in the lurch by the Americans on behalf of Israel. So they're really between a rock and a hard place. There are no good outcomes for them. And they're going to have to navigate the consequences increasingly on their own because I think their trust in Washington has very significantly deteriorated, but they don't feel that they have uh, that they have the possibility to explore significant alternatives.
My last question on Europe. You spoke about the officials in Washington talking in many voices. It's contradicting each other in a matter of maybe 4 minutes or 4 days. Um, Europe seems to be in a similar cocktail. I mean, one day they would say Iran has started this war. They would impose the E3 snapback sanctions, saying that Iran is uh, has violated the JCPOA I'm talking about a few months earlier,
Yeah, it's really incredible.
and they would be sending more reinforcement to Cyprus, and I mean the list goes on and on and on.
Mm.
Uh, and yet there are signs from Spain, in particular, about closing closing its airspace to the use of American warplanes fighting in the war. Of course, there is a background about Spain in recent history during the genocide, declaring Palestinian statehood, etc., etc. In all of this, uh, where is Europe? Is it caught between its slavishness to the American masters and its domestic public opinion that is perhaps on the contrary. What's going on in Europe regarding this war?
Yeah. I've rarely seen anything quite like the European response this past month. I mean, you have, for example, the Secretary General of NATO, the former Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, who has made these absolutely, obsequious, sycophantic statements about what a great service the United States is performing for the world by launching an illegal war of aggression together with Israel against Iran. And then you have, for example, the British who are saying they are not participating in this war, but that the US bombers that are permitted to take off from their airfields and drop tons of explosives on Iran are somehow engaged in defensive operations. And then you have others that are kind of all over the place. Um, I think from the European perspective, they're seeking, to keep the Americans on board because, of course, for them, they're equally concerned about Ukraine and keeping the United States within NATO. But if they think that this constant appeasement and sycophancy and, pardon my French, ass kissing to Trump is really, if they think this is going to do the trick for them, they've they've got something coming because Trump is already denouncing them. He's already denouncing NATO. With for Trump is like Israel. You're either 110% with him or you're a traitor. And the Europeans can't be 110% with him. And the only one who's really taken, I think, a clear position on this is as you mentioned, Spain. This is not going to end well to the Europeans. Now, granted, this is not a situation of their own making, even though they did absolutely nothing to prevent it. Um, but they seem to be going out of their way to make a bad situation as bad as possible for themselves.
We'll leave it there, Moin. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.